The artificial gravity on Diplomatic Station Nexus had been calibrated for optimal comfort across 17 different species, which meant it felt slightly wrong to everyone and perfectly right to no one. I floated through the corridors with the peculiar gait that came from spending too much time in spaces designed by committee, carrying a data pad full of xenobiological notes and what remained of my dignity after this morning's breakfast incident. Dar. Torres, Commander Singh's voice crackled through my communicator with the tone of someone who'd been dealing with interspecies diplomatic crises since before coffee was invented. Please tell me you have good news about the Queen's dietary requirements. I paused in the corridor, watching a group of Centaurian delegates glide past with their characteristic blue-tinged luminescence, and tried to figure out how to explain that the Queen of the Sanguinari Empire had specific preferences that Earth's diplomatic protocol manual hadn't exactly covered. Define good news, I replied, which was probably not the response Commander Singh wanted to hear. The Queen has agreed to the synthetic alternatives we've provided, but she's requested that future meetings include what she calls proper refreshment protocols. I'm still working out exactly what that means. Please tell me it doesn't involve actual blood. Not actual blood, no. But the Sanguinari consider sharing meals to be an important part of diplomatic discourse, and their traditional refreshments are culturally specific. What I didn't mention was that Queen Lyraleth had explained this to me during yesterday's cultural briefing session while maintaining the kind of regal composure that made me forget how to form coherent sentences. 3 years of studying sanguinary biology hadn't prepared me for the reality of sitting across from someone who looked like she'd stepped out of a Renaissance painting, if Renaissance painters had known about perfect bone structure and eyes that seemed to hold centuries of accumulated wisdom. The Sanguinari delegation had arrived 6 days ago aboard a ship that looked like it had been grown rather than built, its organic curves flowing through space with a grace that made human engineering seem clumsy by comparison. Their technology operated on principles that challenged several fundamental assumptions about physics, but that wasn't unusual in my line of work. What was unusual was finding myself appointed as the primary cultural liaison because I'd written my doctoral thesis on theoretical sanguinary social structures. Theoretical being the key word, since most of my research had been based on intercepted communications and long-range observations. Actually meeting them was like discovering that your carefully constructed scientific model had been assembled from incomplete data and wishful thinking. The morning session begins in 20 minutes, Commander Singh continued. Are you ready to translate? As ready as anyone can be to facilitate negotiations between a species that's mastered interstellar travel and another species that's mastered the art of making everything unnecessarily complicated. I made my way to Conference Hall 7, a space designed to accommodate the environmental needs of multiple species simultaneously. The lighting could be adjusted across spectrums invisible to human eyes, the atmosphere could be modified to support different respiratory requirements, and the furniture could reconfigure itself to match the ergonomic preferences of beings who might not have spines in the traditional sense. The human delegation was already seated around their section of the table, looking professionally diplomatic in that special way that suggested they were all desperately hoping someone else knew what they were doing. Ambassador Chen reviewed her notes with the focused intensity of someone who'd spent her career navigating political minefields and had recently discovered that some of those minefields might literally explode. The Sanguinari delegation entered with the kind of coordinated grace that made it clear they'd been doing this sort of thing for centuries. Queen Lyraleth moved at the center of the group, her presence somehow managing to make the vast conference hall feel intimate and slightly overwhelming at the same time. She was tall even by Sanguinari standards, with the pale complexion that came from generations of avoiding direct sunlight and features that suggested both delicate beauty and absolute authority. Her dark hair was arranged in styles that incorporated what appeared to be living vines, and her clothing seemed to shift between fabric and something more organic depending on the lighting. But it was her eyes that made conversation difficult. They were dark enough to be almost black, but when the light caught them right, they showed depths that suggested she'd seen empires rise and fall and had learned to find humor in the fundamental absurdity of existence. Dr. Torres, she said as the delegations took their seats, her voice carrying the slight accent that came from speaking dozens of languages across several centuries, I trust your morning refreshment was more successful than yesterday's attempt. I tried not to think about yesterday's breakfast incident, which had involved me attempting to operate an alien food synthesizer and accidentally creating something that looked like it belonged in a xenobiology textbook under the heading, "Things That Should Not Exist." "Much better, Your Majesty. Though I'm still not entirely sure what I ordered." Her lips curved in what might have been amusement, though with the Sanguinari it was sometimes difficult to tell. Their expressions operated on subtleties that human facial recognition hadn't evolved to interpret. Ambassador Chen called the session to order, launching into the carefully prepared remarks about mutual cooperation and shared prosperity that formed the foundation of diplomatic discourse. The translation software handled most of the formal language, but cultural nuances required human interpretation. "The Queen wishes to know," I found myself saying after the opening remarks, "whether humans truly believe that peace can be achieved through documents, or if you understand that lasting agreements require deeper connections between peoples." Ambassador Chen paused, clearly recognizing that this wasn't exactly a standard diplomatic question. "Please convey to Her Majesty that we believe written agreements provide the framework within which deeper understanding can develop." I translated, watching the Queen's expression for clues about her response. The Sanguinari had been observing human civilization for decades, studying our habits and social structures with the patience of beings who measure time in centuries rather than years. "She says," I continued after her reply, "that the Sanguinari have observed that humans often create elaborate rules to govern behavior they find difficult to understand intuitively. She's curious whether this represents wisdom or a fundamental limitation in human social development." The conference hall fell quiet except for the gentle hum of environmental systems working to maintain optimal conditions for interspecies dialogue. Ambassador Chen's expression suggested she was reconsidering her career choices. "Dr. Torres," she said carefully, "please ask Her Majesty what the Sanguinari consider to be the foundation of successful diplomatic relations." I posed the question, noting the way Queen Lyraleth's attention seemed to focus not just on the words but on the subtle cues of body language and vocal tone that conveyed meaning beyond mere vocabulary. "She says the foundation is recognition that all sentient beings share certain fundamental needs: security, purpose, connection, and the hope that their actions will have meaning beyond their individual existence. She notes that humans and Sanguinari may express these needs differently, but the underlying desires are remarkably similar." Ambassador Chen nodded slowly. "That's, actually quite insightful. Please ask Her Majesty how she would recommend we proceed with establishing formal relations between our peoples." The Queen's response took several minutes, during which she spoke with the kind of thoughtful precision that came from having participated in diplomatic negotiations across multiple star systems and several centuries of experience. "She suggests," I translated, "that rather than beginning with trade agreements and territorial boundaries, we should start by addressing the fundamental question of whether our species can coexist without losing what makes each of us unique. She says the Sanguinari have learned that diversity strengthens civilizations, but only when differences are celebrated rather than merely tolerated." The morning session continued with discussions that ranged from practical concerns about resource sharing to philosophical questions about the nature of consciousness and the responsibilities of advanced civilizations. I found myself serving not just as a translator but as a cultural interpreter, helping both sides understand not just what was being said but what was being meant. During a break between sessions, Queen Lyraleth approached me in the observation lounge, a space with transparent walls that offered views of the star field beyond the station. "Dr. Torres," she said, settling into one of the chairs with the fluid grace that characterized all Sanguinari movement, "you translate our words with remarkable accuracy, but I sense you understand more than mere language." I tried to think of a response that wouldn't sound like complete academic gibberish. "Your Majesty, I've spent years studying Sanguinari culture, but I'm discovering that research and reality are quite different things." "In what way?" "Well, for instance, my research suggested that Sanguinari social interactions were based on complex hierarchical structures and formal protocols. But observing your delegation, I see that the reality is much more nuanced. You operate more like a family than a government bureaucracy." Her eyes showed what was definitely amusement this time. "You are observant. We have learned that rigid hierarchies become brittle over the course of centuries. Flexibility and mutual support serve us better for long-term stability. That makes sense. Though it does mean I need to revise several chapters of my dissertation. Consider it an opportunity for expanded research rather than a failure of previous scholarship. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the stars whirl slowly past the observation windows. The view reminded me that we were literally surrounded by the vast emptiness of space, held in a tiny bubble of artificial atmosphere and gravity, conducting negotiations that could determine the future relationship between two entire civilizations. Dr. Torres, the Queen said eventually, "May I ask what originally attracted you to the study of my people?" I considered the question, trying to find an answer that was both honest and professionally appropriate. Initially, it was scientific curiosity. The Sanguinari represent a fascinating example of parallel evolution, similar enough to humans to be recognizable, different enough to be genuinely alien. But the more I learned, the more I became interested in the philosophical implications. Which are the question of whether different forms of consciousness can truly understand each other, or whether we're all just projecting our own assumptions onto behaviors we observe but can't really comprehend. The Queen was quiet for a long moment, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight from the observation windows. "And what conclusion have you reached?" "I think understanding is possible, but it requires abandoning the assumption that our own perspective is the only valid one. It means accepting that there might be entirely different ways of experiencing existence that are just as real and meaningful as our own. That is a remarkably mature perspective for someone of your species." Is that a compliment or an observation about human limitations in general? Both. I laughed, which seemed to surprise her slightly. "Your Majesty, has anyone ever told you that you have a talent for diplomatic honesty? It is considered one of my more dangerous qualities." The afternoon session proved more challenging than the morning discussions, as both delegations began addressing specific issues that could become sources of conflict. Questions about territorial boundaries, resource rights, and technology sharing revealed the fundamental differences in how humans and Sanguinari approached long-term planning. The Queen points out, "I found myself explaining to increasingly tense human negotiators, that humans seem to make decisions based on electoral cycles and quarterly reports, while Sanguinari plan in terms of centuries and millennia. She's concerned that any agreements we reach might be abandoned by future human administrations that don't share current priorities." Ambassador Chen rubbed her temples with the expression of someone dealing with a migraine that had achieved diplomatic status. "Ask Her Majesty how the Sanguinari suggest we address this incompatibility in planning horizons." The Queen's response was lengthy and complex, requiring several rounds of clarification before I felt confident in my translation. She suggests that rather than trying to create permanent agreements, we should focus on establishing principles and frameworks that can evolve over time. She says the Sanguinari have learned that the most successful long-term relationships are based on shared values rather than specific rules. And what values does she think our species share? Curiosity, creativity, the desire to protect those we care about, and what she calls, the stubborn refusal to accept that problems are unsolvable. She says these qualities suggest that humans and Sanguinari could learn much from each other. The day's sessions concluded with tentative agreements on several minor points and the establishment of working groups to address major issues. As the delegations dispersed, I found myself walking with Queen Lyraleth toward the residential sections of the station. "Dr. Torres," she said as we reached the junction where our paths would diverge, "I wanted to thank you for your translation services today. You managed to convey not just our words, but our intentions. It's an honor to serve in this capacity, Your Majesty. Though I have to admit, I'm still learning how to navigate the cultural complexities. We are all learning. That is what makes this process worthwhile." She paused, studying my expression with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than I was entirely comfortable with. "Perhaps tomorrow we might continue our earlier conversation about consciousness and understanding. I find your perspective refreshing." As I watched her glide away down the corridor with that characteristic Sanguinari grace, I realized that my interest in this diplomatic mission had evolved well beyond professional curiosity. Queen Lyraleth was intelligent, thoughtful, possessed of a humor that was both subtle and sharp, and beautiful in a way that seemed to exist outside normal human categories. She was also an immortal alien ruler whose species had mastered interstellar travel while humans were still figuring out agriculture, which made any personal interest I might be developing both inappropriate and completely insane. I made my way back to my quarters, trying to focus on preparing for tomorrow's sessions rather than thinking about dark eyes that held centuries of accumulated wisdom and a smile that suggested she found the universe endlessly amusing. It was going to be a long diplomatic mission. The station's artificial dawn cycle found me in the xenobiology lab, surrounded by data screens displaying everything I thought I knew about sanguinari physiology and social structures. 3 cups of coffee and 4 hours of research later, I was beginning to suspect that my doctoral thesis had been based more on creative speculation than actual scientific observation. Computer, display comparative analysis of sanguinari longevity factors and human aging processes, I commanded, watching as holographic models appeared showing the cellular differences between species that measured lifespan in decades versus those that measured it in centuries. The door chimed with the characteristic harmony that indicated a sanguinari visitor. I looked up to find Queen Lyraleth standing in the entrance, looking remarkably elegant for someone who shouldn't have been awake during what her species considered peak daylight hours. "Your Majesty," I said, scrambling to turn off the holographic displays before she could see the rather unflattering comparison between human and sanguinari cellular regeneration rates. "I wasn't expecting." "That is, I thought you preferred evening schedules." "I do, but I find your human concept of morning coffee intriguing. Dr. Singh mentioned that you spend considerable time in this laboratory, and I was curious about your research." She moved into the lab with that fluid grace that made ordinary furniture seem clumsy, her attention drawn to the displays I hadn't managed to deactivate quickly enough. The holographic models showed sanguinari neural structures alongside human equivalents, highlighting the additional neural pathways that allowed for enhanced memory retention and sensory processing. "Fascinating," she said, studying the displays with genuine interest. "Though I notice your data appears to be based primarily on theoretical models rather than direct observation." I felt heat rising in my cheeks. "Well, yes. It's somewhat difficult to conduct comprehensive biological studies when your research subjects live on the other side of the galaxy and are generally reluctant to participate in invasive medical procedures." "Understandable. We have similar limitations in our studies of human physiology, though we have had more opportunities for direct observation." "You've been studying humans?" Her expression suggested mild amusement at my surprise. "Dar. Torres, did you think we would enter into diplomatic relations with a species we understood only from theoretical models?" Actually, yes. That's pretty much exactly what we're doing." "Indeed. Which suggests that either the sanguinari are more cautious than humans, or humans are more optimistic than sanguinari." "Probably both." She approached one of the displays showing sanguinari social structures, tilting her head as she studied my interpretations of their governmental systems. "Your analysis of our political organization is quite perceptive, though you seem to have missed some important nuances." "Such as?" "You describe our society as a monarchical system with hereditary succession, but you fail to account for the reality that hereditary has different implications when the monarch in question has been ruling for over 8 centuries. I stared at her, doing rapid calculations in my head. 8 centuries. But that would mean you've been queen since. Since what your historians call the late medieval period, yes. I have observed the rise and fall of human empires, the development of your scientific revolution, your first tentative steps into space. From our perspective, humans have progressed from primitive agricultural societies to interstellar capability in remarkably little time. The implications of this hit me like a revelation about the nature of perspective itself. You've been watching our entire modern development. We have found human civilization to be entertaining. Your species approaches problems with a combination of intelligence and impulsiveness that produces remarkably creative solutions. Entertaining? Consider your approach to space travel. Sanguinari development followed logical progressions. First mastering our home environment, then our solar system, then gradually expanding outward as our technology and understanding advanced. Humans, by contrast, went from powered flight to orbital mechanics in 67 years, then began attempting interstellar travel before fully understanding the principles involved. And this is entertaining. It is refreshing. Most species we encounter are either too cautious to attempt anything genuinely innovative, or too advanced to require the kind of creative problem-solving that humans seem to specialize in. I tried to process the idea that human civilization was apparently the galactic equivalent of an interesting television program. So when you say you've been studying us, I mean that we have extensive records of human cultural development, technological advancement, and social evolution. We understand your species better than you might expect. But you still agreed to these negotiations. Because understanding and communication are different skills. We may comprehend human behavior, but we have had limited opportunities for direct interaction. She moved to another display, this one showing my theoretical models of sanguinari emotional and social bonding patterns. Your analysis of our relationship structures is particularly interesting, though again somewhat incomplete. Incomplete how? You correctly identify that sanguinari form deep, lasting bonds with others of our species. What you miss is that these bonds are not limited by conventional biological categories. I'm not sure I understand. Sanguinari society values connection based on intellectual and emotional compatibility rather than traditional reproductive partnerships. We form what you might call family units based on choice rather than genetics. I found myself wondering if this was getting into territory that was more personal than professional. And these chosen families, do they include individuals from other species? Rarely, given the practical complications involved. But it is not unknown. The way she said this suggested there was more to the statement than casual anthropological observation, but before I could figure out how to ask for clarification, my communicator chimed with Commander Singh's voice announcing the morning briefing session. Dr. Torres, please report to Conference Hall 7. We're receiving preliminary responses from Earth Command regarding yesterday's negotiations. Duty calls, I said, gathering my data pads and trying to ignore the fact that spending 20 minutes discussing sanguinari biology with Queen Lyraleth had been more interesting than 3 years of theoretical research. Indeed. Though perhaps we might continue this conversation later. I find your perspective on interspecies relations quite illuminating. The briefing session revealed that Earth Command was cautiously optimistic about the negotiations but concerned about some of the philosophical questions the sanguinari had raised. Ambassador Chen distributed reports from various Earth governments, each expressing different priorities and concerns about establishing formal relations with an alien species. The European Federation is particularly interested in technology sharing agreements, Ambassador Chen explained, reading from her data pad. The African Union wants assurances about territorial sovereignty. The Americas Collective is focused on trade opportunities. And what does Earth Command think the sanguinari want from these negotiations? Asked Dr. Martinez, our team's sociologist. That's the interesting question. Based on preliminary discussions, they seem less interested in tangible benefits and more interested in what they call expanding the scope of meaningful interaction. I raised my hand. If I may, I think the sanguinari approach this differently than we do. They're thinking in terms of centuries rather than years. They're not looking for immediate benefits but for the potential of long-term relationship development. Relationship development? Think of it as cosmic friendship. They want to know if humans are the kind of species they'd want to maintain contact with over the long term. Dr. Martinez frowned. And how do we demonstrate that? By being honest about who we are rather than trying to impress them with who we think they want us to be. The afternoon negotiations focused on practical questions about communication protocols, territorial boundaries, and the establishment of formal diplomatic channels. The discussions were productive but somewhat dry, covering the necessary details that would form the foundation of any future agreements. During a break between sessions, I found myself in the station's botanical gardens, a space designed to showcase plant life from various worlds. The Sanguinari had contributed several species that seemed to thrive in low-light conditions, their leaves shimmering with bioluminescent patterns that created constantly shifting displays of natural art. The luminous ferns of Sanguinar Prime, Queen Lyraleth's voice said behind me. They respond to emotional resonances in their environment. I turned to find her approaching through the garden paths, her presence somehow making the space feel more intimate despite its considerable size. Emotional resonances. They perceive and reflect the emotional states of sentient beings in their vicinity. Currently, they seem to be responding to curiosity, mild anxiety, and what appears to be uncertainty. I looked at the ferns, noting that their bioluminescent patterns had indeed shifted to display gentle pulses of blue and green light with occasional flickers of yellow. They can actually sense emotions. Among other things. Sanguinari biotechnology has developed along different lines than human mechanical engineering. We prefer to work with living systems rather than artificial constructs. That explains why your ships look grown rather than built. Precisely. We find that organic technology is more adaptable and self-maintaining than mechanical alternatives. We walked through the garden in comfortable silence, passing displays of alien flora that challenged several assumptions about the requirements for plant life. Some thrived in conditions that should have been impossible, others displayed behaviors that seemed more characteristic of animals than vegetation. Gabriel Torres, the Queen said as we paused beside a fountain that used some kind of liquid that definitely wasn't water. May I ask you a personal question? Of course, Your Majesty. Do you enjoy your work as a xenobiologist? The question caught me off guard with its simplicity. Yes, very much. Though I have to admit, actually meeting the subjects of my research has been somewhat humbling. How so? I spent years developing theories about Sanguinari society and culture based on limited data. Now I'm discovering that reality is far more complex and interesting than my model suggested. And this troubles you? It excites me. There's so much more to learn, so many questions I never thought to ask. She nodded thoughtfully. This is why we find humans intriguing. Most species become comfortable with their understanding of the universe and resist information that challenges their assumptions. Humans seem to thrive on discovering that they were wrong about things. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It is a rare thing. Most advanced civilizations develop intellectual arrogance as they accumulate knowledge. Humans appear to maintain intellectual curiosity even as they achieve greater understanding. We call it beginner's mind, the idea that the more you learn, the more you realize how much you don't know. A wisdom that serves exploration well. We had reached a secluded alcove where the garden designers had placed seating areas surrounded by plants that seemed to provide natural privacy screens. Queen Lyraleth settled onto one of the benches with that characteristic fluid grace, and I found myself sitting beside her, close enough to notice that she smelled like night-blooming flowers and something that might have been starlight if starlight had a scent. Gabriel Torres, she said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been vulnerability. May I share an observation about these negotiations? Please. I have participated in diplomatic discussions with dozens of species across several centuries. Most approach these meetings as competitions, seeking advantage, calculating benefit, attempting to maximize their position while minimizing concessions. And humans? Humans seem genuinely interested in understanding whether meaningful cooperation is possible. Your questions are not, how can we benefit, but, how can we work together? Is that unusual? It is, refreshing. Though it raises questions about human motivations that I find myself curious to explore. I turned to look at her, noting the way the bioluminescent ferns had shifted their display to warmer colors. Gold and amber patterns that seemed to respond to the changing emotional tenor of our conversation. What kind of questions? Whether human interest in cooperation is based on practical considerations or something more fundamental. Whether your species forms attachments based on utility or genuine affection. The conversation had definitely moved beyond professional territory, but I found myself reluctant to redirect it back to safer ground. I think humans are capable of both. We can form relationships based on practical necessity, but our strongest connections usually involve genuine emotional attachment. And these emotional attachments, do they extend beyond your own species? I met her dark eyes, seeing something in them that might have been hope or might have been curiosity or might have been something else entirely. Some of them do. I see. The ferns around us had shifted to displaying deep purple and silver patterns, their bioluminescent pulses synchronized with what appeared to be the rhythm of heartbeats. The Queen noticed the change and smiled with what was definitely amusement. It seems our conversation is affecting the local flora. Is that a problem? Only if you object to botanical commentary on our emotional states. I think I can live with plant-based relationship advice. Her laughter was like music, carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the garden's acoustic design. Dr. Torres, you have a remarkable ability to find humor in unusual situations. It's a survival skill. When you spend your career studying things that challenge your understanding of reality, you either learn to laugh or you go insane. And you have chosen laughter. Most of the time. Though I have to admit, these negotiations are testing my ability to find anything amusing about the situation. Why? I hesitated, realizing that I was about to say something that could complicate the diplomatic process, compromise my professional standing, and probably violate several regulations about appropriate behavior during interspecies negotiations. Because I'm discovering that some complications are worth having. The Queen was quiet for a long moment, studying my expression with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than I was entirely comfortable revealing. The ferns continued their synchronized display, painting the alcove in shifting patterns of light that somehow made the moment feel suspended outside normal time. Dr. Torres, she said finally, are you suggesting that our interactions have become personally meaningful to you? I'm suggesting that if these negotiations fail, I'll regret losing the opportunity to continue learning about Sanguinari culture. Culture. Among other things. She smiled, and for the first time since the negotiations began, it was a smile without diplomatic calculation or careful consideration of political implications. It was simply genuine. Among other things, she agreed. The morning briefing brought news that complicated everything. Commander Singh's expression suggested she'd been dealing with problems that had achieved unprecedented levels of bureaucratic complexity, while Ambassador Chen looked like she'd been wrestling with diplomatic challenges that had evolved beyond normal human comprehension. We've received communications from Earth Command, Ambassador Chen announced, distributing data pads to the assembled human delegation. The preliminary reports about our negotiations have generated significant interest from various Earth governments. I scanned the reports, noting that several major powers were expressing concerns about the implications of formal relations with an advanced alien species. The usual worries about technological dependence, cultural contamination, and loss of human autonomy were all represented, along with some creative new anxieties I hadn't previously considered. The Asian Cooperative is concerned about the long-term effects of interacting with a species that lives for centuries, Dr. Martinez observed. They're worried about becoming overly dependent on alien wisdom and losing our capacity for independent decision-making. The Nordic Union has questions about the environmental implications, added Dr. Yates, our environmental specialist. They want to know whether Sanguinari biotechnology could disrupt Earth's ecological balance. And the American Federation, Ambassador Chen continued with the tone of someone delivering particularly unwelcome news, is requesting detailed intelligence about Sanguinari military capabilities and strategic intentions. I looked up from the reports. Strategic intentions? They want to know whether the Sanguinari represent a potential threat to human security interests. Based on what possible evidence? Based on the assumption that any species advanced enough to achieve interstellar travel must have military applications for their technology. Commander Singh cleared her throat. Dr. Torres, you've had more direct interaction with the Sanguinari delegation than anyone else. What's your assessment of their potential threat level? I tried to figure out how to explain that the biggest threat the Sanguinari posed was to my emotional equilibrium and professional objectivity. Commander, based on my observations, the Sanguinari could have conquered Earth decades ago if that had been their intention. They have biotechnology that operates on principles we barely understand, ships that can fold space for faster-than-light travel, and a level of scientific advancement that makes our most sophisticated equipment look like stone tools. And they've spent the last week asking thoughtful questions about human philosophy and sharing their own cultural perspectives. If they wanted to threaten us, I think they'd be more direct about it. Dr. Martinez frowned. But surely they must have some strategic objectives for these negotiations. I think their objective is to determine whether humans are interesting enough to maintain contact with over the long term. Interesting enough? The Sanguinari measure time in centuries. They're not looking for immediate benefits from these negotiations. They're trying to assess whether humans represent a species worth developing a long-term relationship with. Ambassador Chen made notes on her data pad. And what do you think their assessment will be? I think it depends on whether we can demonstrate that we're capable of thinking beyond immediate self-interest. The afternoon session began with Queen Lyraleth asking questions that seemed designed to probe the deeper implications of human-Sanguinari cooperation. Her inquiries ranged from practical concerns about technology transfer to philosophical questions about the nature of friendship between species with vastly different lifespans. Dr. Torres, she said during a break in the formal discussions, I am curious about human perspectives on long-term relationships. I glanced around the conference hall, noting that the other delegates were engaged in separate conversations about trade agreements and territorial boundaries. In what context, Your Majesty? Do humans form attachments that are intended to last beyond immediate practical needs? The question seemed innocent enough, but something in her tone suggested deeper implications. Yes, though the definition of long-term varies depending on human lifespan limitations. And these attachments, do they require reciprocal longevity to be meaningful? I found myself wondering if we were still discussing diplomatic relations or something more personal. Not necessarily. Humans form meaningful attachments knowing that they're temporary. We value relationships for their quality rather than their duration. Even when the disparity in lifespan creates inevitable loss. Especially then. Humans tend to believe that the temporary nature of relationships makes them more precious, not less. The Queen considered this, her dark eyes reflecting the conference hall's lighting in patterns that seemed to shift with her emotional state. This is a perspective the Sanguinari find difficult to understand. We form bonds intended to last centuries. The idea of choosing connection despite guaranteed separation seems insane. Brave. The formal negotiations resumed with discussions about the practical framework for ongoing contact between human and Sanguinari civilizations. The details were complex but manageable: communication protocols, cultural exchange programs, joint research initiatives that could benefit both species. But as the day progressed, I began to notice an undercurrent of tension among the human delegation. Ambassador Chen's questions became more pointed. Dr. Martinez started taking detailed notes about Sanguinari capabilities, and even Commander Singh seemed to be viewing the negotiations through a strategic lens that hadn't been present during earlier sessions. During the evening break, I found Queen Lyraleth in the observation lounge, standing before the transparent walls that offered views of the star field beyond the station. She seemed smaller somehow, less regal and more vulnerable than she appeared during formal negotiations. Your Majesty, I said, approaching carefully, you seem troubled. I have been considering the reports your delegation received this morning. I felt a chill of apprehension. How do you know about the reports? Dr. Torres, we have been observing human civilization for centuries. Did you think we would enter these negotiations without the ability to monitor your communications? You've been spying on us. We have been ensuring our security, just as your Earth governments are currently doing with regard to our delegation. The implications of this hit me like a revelation about the fundamental nature of the negotiations we've been conducting. So you know about the concerns Earth Command has been raising? We know that some of your governments view these negotiations as intelligence-gathering opportunities rather than genuine diplomatic discourse. And how do you feel about that? She turned from the observation windows to face me, her expression carrying a sadness that seemed to encompass centuries of disappointing experiences with interspecies relations. We had hoped that humans might be different. Different how? Most species we encounter approach first contact as either a threat to be neutralized or an opportunity to be exploited. We had observed human behavior patterns that suggested your species might be capable of genuine curiosity about others. Some of us are. But not your governments. I tried to find a response that was both honest and hopeful. Governments are complicated. They have to consider worst-case scenarios and prepare for possibilities that individuals might not worry about. And what do you think about the possibilities they are preparing for? I think they're afraid of things that are probably inevitable anyway. Such as change. The discovery that humans aren't the most advanced species in the galaxy. The realization that our assumptions about the universe are probably wrong about more things than they're right about. She moved closer, close enough that I could see the complex patterns in her dark eyes, like looking into depths that held reflections of starlight and time. And you are not afraid of these things? I'm terrified of them. But I'm more afraid of missing the opportunity to learn something extraordinary because I was too scared to risk being wrong about what I thought I knew. The Queen was quiet for a long moment, studying my expression with an intensity that seemed to search for something beyond words. Dr. Torres, may I ask you another personal question? Of course. If these negotiations were to conclude successfully, and regular contact were established between our species, would you be interested in continuing our discussions about consciousness and understanding? The question hung in the air between us, carrying implications that extended well beyond professional interest. I realized that my answer would affect not just my own future but potentially the entire relationship between human and Sanguinari civilizations. Yes, I said. Very much. Even knowing that such discussions might lead to personal attachments that would be complicated by the differences between our species. Especially knowing that. Her smile was radiant, transforming her entire expression from regal composure to something warmer and more personal. Then perhaps there is hope for these negotiations after all. The next morning brought crisis in the form of Ambassador Chen's announcement that Earth Command was expressing serious concerns about the security implications of continuing negotiations. Several governments were demanding more detailed intelligence about Sanguinari military capabilities before proceeding with any formal agreements. They want technical specifications. I asked, reading through the communications that had arrived during the night cycle. They want assurances that the Sanguinari don't represent a potential threat to human independence and security, Ambassador Chen replied, though her tone suggested she was delivering someone else's position rather than expressing her own views. And how exactly are we supposed to obtain those assurances? By asking direct questions about their defensive capabilities and strategic intentions. I stared at her, trying to process the implications of what she was suggesting. Ambassador, you want me to ask the Queen of an advanced alien civilization to provide detailed information about their military technology so that human governments can assess whether they need to be afraid of her? That's a somewhat reductive interpretation, but essentially correct. And you think this approach will improve human-Sanguinari relations? I think this approach will address legitimate security concerns raised by the people we represent. The morning session began with Ambassador Chen posing the questions that Earth Command had demanded, translated through diplomatic language but clearly requesting intelligence about Sanguinari defensive capabilities and long-term strategic plans. The Sanguinari delegation received these inquiries with expressions that suggested polite confusion rather than offense. Queen Lyraleth's response was measured and thoughtful, but I could sense the disappointment underlying her words as I translated them for the human delegation. Her Majesty says that the Sanguinari understand human concerns about security, but she notes that requests for detailed military intelligence suggest a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of the relationship she had hoped to establish. Ambassador Chen frowned. What kind of misunderstanding? She says that friends do not typically begin relationships by assessing each other's capacity for mutual destruction. Please convey to Her Majesty that human governments have responsibilities to ensure the safety of their populations. I translated the response, watching the Queen's expression become more formally diplomatic and less personally engaged. Her reply carried undertones that suggested the conversation was moving in directions she found deeply regrettable. She says that the Sanguinari have similar responsibilities to their people, which is why they must carefully consider whether humans represent a species capable of mature interstellar relationships. And what would constitute maturity in this context? The ability to approach differences as opportunities for learning rather than threats to be neutralized. The session continued with increasingly tense discussions about security concerns, technological safeguards, and the establishment of monitoring protocols that would allow both species to maintain defensive capabilities while developing cooperative relationships. The atmosphere in the conference hall had shifted from diplomatic optimism to careful calculation, with both sides now approaching the negotiations as strategic exercises rather than genuine attempts at understanding. During the lunch break, I found myself alone in the botanical gardens, sitting beside the fountain while trying to figure out how the morning's discussions had gone so wrong so quickly. The bioluminescent ferns were displaying muted colors, grays and pale blues that seemed to reflect the emotional tone of recent events. They are responding to disappointment, Queen Lyraleth's voice said behind me. I turned to find her approaching through the garden paths, her posture still regal but somehow less commanding than it had been during earlier meetings. Your Majesty, I wanted to apologize for this morning's session. The questions Ambassador Chen asked were the questions your governments needed to ask, she interrupted gently. I understand the position your delegation finds itself in. But it's not the conversation you were hoping to have. No. It is not. She settled beside me on the bench, close enough that I could sense the subtle energy field that seemed to surround all Sanguinari, like being near a source of warmth that existed in dimensions beyond normal physical space. Dr. Torres, she said, I want you to understand that the Sanguinari bear no resentment toward humanity for these concerns. Security is a legitimate consideration when establishing relations between species. But I had hoped that humans might be capable of approaching these negotiations with the kind of trust that makes meaningful relationships possible. And instead we're treating you like a potential enemy that needs to be analyzed and contained. You are treating us like a powerful neighbor whose intentions must be carefully assessed before commitments are made. This is rational behavior. But it's not what you were looking for. What I was looking for was evidence that humans could move beyond rational calculation to genuine connection. We sat in silence for a moment, listening to the gentle sounds of alien water features and the subtle rustling of bioluminescent plants responding to emotional resonances in their environment. Your Majesty, I said eventually, what would it take to restore the possibility of genuine connection? Honest communication about what each species hopes to gain from these negotiations. And what do the Sanguinari hope to gain? She turned to look at me with those dark eyes that seemed to hold centuries of accumulated wisdom and loneliness. We hope to discover that we are not alone in the universe in ways that matter beyond mere biological coincidence. And what do you think humans hope to gain? That is what I am still trying to understand. I found myself wondering if the question she was really asking was what I hoped to gain from these negotiations, and whether my answer would be honest enough to matter. Some humans hope to gain security, others hope to gain advantage, others hope to gain knowledge, I said. But I think some of us hope to gain the same thing you do. Which is the discovery that we're not alone in the universe in ways that matter. The ferns around us shifted to warmer colors. Gold and amber patterns that painted the alcove in gentle light. Queen Lyraleth smiled, and for the first time that day, it was a smile without diplomatic reservation. Dr. Torres, she said, would you be willing to help me understand what might be possible if these negotiations were to succeed? What do you mean? I mean that I would like to explore whether the connection we have developed during these discussions represents something that could grow beyond diplomatic necessity. The implications of her words hung in the air between us like a question that could change everything or destroy everything depending on how it was answered. "Your Majesty," I said, my heart doing things that probably violated several laws of cardiovascular physics, "are you asking me what I think you're asking me?" "That depends on what you think I am asking." "I think you're asking whether I'm interested in exploring a personal relationship that would transcend the professional requirements of these negotiations. And what is your response to such a question?" I looked into her eyes, seeing depths that held starlight and time and the accumulated wisdom of centuries, and realized that my answer would determine not just my own future but possibly the entire trajectory of human Sanguinari relations. My response is yes. Her smile was radiant enough to power small suns. The emergency session began at dawn with Ambassador Chen announcing that Earth Command had issued new directives regarding the negotiations. Her expression suggested she was delivering news that had evolved beyond mere diplomatic complications into something approaching cosmic disaster. "The Joint Chiefs are recommending immediate suspension of talks pending a full security assessment," she read from her data pad, her voice carrying the tone of someone who disagreed with the message she was required to deliver. They're concerned that continued negotiations without proper safeguards could compromise Earth's defensive capabilities. I stared at the assembled human delegation, trying to process the implications of what I'd just heard. They want to suspend the negotiations. Temporarily. Until we can establish appropriate security protocols. And how long is temporarily expected to last? Ambassador Chen's expression answered the question before her words did. Indefinitely. The Sanguinari delegation received this news with the kind of composed dignity that somehow made their disappointment more profound than anger would have been. Queen Lyraleth listened to my translation of Earth Command's position, her dark eyes reflecting something that might have been sadness or might have been the patient acceptance that came from centuries of experience with diplomatic failures. "Her Majesty says she understands the position of human governments," I found myself translating, though her actual words had carried undertones of profound regret that no translation could adequately convey. She notes that the Sanguinari have encountered similar responses from other species when significant cultural differences made trust difficult to establish. "Please ask Her Majesty how other species have resolved these trust issues," Ambassador Chen requested. The Queen's response was brief and carried finality that made my chest tighten with something approaching panic. She says that in most cases, they have not been resolved. The Sanguinari maintain polite but distant relations with species that view them primarily as potential threats rather than potential allies. And what does that mean for future human-Sanguinari relations? It means that formal diplomatic contact will be limited to essential communications, with no ongoing cultural or scientific exchange programs. The morning session concluded with arrangements for the orderly conclusion of negotiations and the departure of both delegations from Diplomatic Station Nexus. The process was handled with professional courtesy and diplomatic protocol, but underneath the formal procedures was the unmistakable reality that an opportunity for something extraordinary had been lost to fear and political calculation. During the lunch break, I found myself walking through the station's corridors like someone in a daze, trying to understand how everything had gone wrong so quickly. The prospect of returning to Earth and resuming my previous life of theoretical research seemed suddenly unbearable, like being asked to go back to studying shadows after experiencing direct sunlight. "Dr. Torres," Commander Singh's voice called out behind me. "A moment, if you please." I turned to find her approaching with an expression that suggested professional concern mixed with personal sympathy. "Commander, I wanted to discuss your future assignment options. Given your expertise in Sanguinari culture, Earth Command is interested in having you continue your research as part of our xenobiology monitoring program." Monitoring program? Long-range observation and analysis of alien civilizations. Keeping track of potential threats and opportunities for future contact. The idea of spending the rest of my career watching the Sanguinari from a distance, analyzing their communications and speculating about their intentions while never again having the opportunity for direct interaction, felt like a special kind of academic hell. "Commander, may I speak freely?" "Of course. I think Earth Command is making a serious mistake. The Sanguinari aren't a threat. They're a potential ally that we're rejecting because we're too afraid to trust anyone we don't completely understand. Dr. Torres, I appreciate your perspective, but surely you understand the security implications. I understand that we're choosing fear over curiosity, suspicion over friendship, and isolation over the chance to learn something that could transform human civilization. Commander Singh studied my expression with the careful attention of someone reassessing a situation. Dr. Torres, are your objections to this decision based purely on professional considerations? The question hung in the air between us, carrying implications that could affect my career, my security clearance, and my future with any Earth government agency. I realized that my answer would determine whether I spent the rest of my life regretting choices I was too afraid to make. No, Commander. They're not purely professional. I see. And what other considerations are involved? Personal ones that would be complicated to explain and probably inappropriate to discuss in a professional context. She nodded slowly. Dr. Torres, you should know that your performance during these negotiations has been exemplary. Your translations were accurate, your cultural insights were valuable, and your conduct has been professional throughout. Thank you, Commander. However, I should also mention that your personal communications have been monitored as part of standard security protocols during diplomatic missions. I felt heat rising in my cheeks as the implications of this sank in. You've been monitoring my conversations with Queen Lyraleth. We've been monitoring all communications between human and Sanguinari personnel. It's standard procedure. And what did you discover? That you've developed what appears to be genuine emotional attachment to an alien head of state, and that she appears to reciprocate those feelings. Is that a problem? Commander Singh was quiet for a long moment, studying my expression with something that might have been sympathy. Dr. Torres, under normal circumstances, emotional involvement with diplomatic contacts would be grounds for reassignment and possible disciplinary action. And under these circumstances? Under these circumstances, I'm wondering if your emotional involvement might represent information that Earth Command should consider before making final decisions about human-Sanguinari relations. I stared at her, trying to parse the implications of what she was suggesting. Information. Evidence that meaningful personal connections are possible between humans and Sanguinari. Evidence that their intentions toward humanity might be genuinely friendly rather than strategically calculated. And you think this information would matter to Earth Command? I think it might matter to people who are currently making decisions based on worst-case scenario planning rather than best-case possibility assessment. The afternoon brought news that the Sanguinari delegation would be departing the following morning, their own governmental representatives having concluded that human fear of alien contact made productive negotiations impossible under current circumstances. The formal farewell ceremonies were scheduled for the evening, after which both delegations would return to their respective homeworlds with polite expressions of mutual respect and no concrete agreements for future cooperation. I spent the time before the farewell ceremonies walking through the station's botanical gardens, trying to memorize the sight of alien plants that I might never see again and wondering if the bioluminescent ferns could sense heartbreak as clearly as they sensed other emotions. Their current display suggested they could, muted purples and grays that painted the garden paths in colors that matched my emotional state. They are responding to loss, Queen Lyraleth's voice said behind me. I turned to find her approaching through the garden, moving with that characteristic grace but somehow seeming less regal and more vulnerable than during our previous meetings. Her presence still made the air around us shimmer with subtle energy, but now that energy carried undertones of sadness that made my chest tighten. Your Majesty, I said, trying to find words that would be adequate for what might be our final conversation. I wanted to apologize for how these negotiations concluded. Earth Command's decision to suspend talks doesn't represent the views of all humans. I understand the position your governments found themselves in, she replied, settling beside me on the bench where we'd shared so many previous conversations. Security concerns are legitimate when dealing with unknown quantities. But you're not an unknown quantity anymore. At least, not to me. She turned to study my expression with those dark eyes that seemed to hold starlight and time. And what do you think you know about me, Dr. Torres? I know that you're intelligent, thoughtful, possessed of a sense of humor that's both subtle and sharp. I know that you care deeply about your people and that you've spent centuries making decisions that affect the future of an entire civilization. I know that you approach problems with patience and wisdom, and that you see possibilities where others see only obstacles. And I know that spending the last week talking with you has been the most intellectually and emotionally engaging experience of my life. The ferns around us shifted to warmer colors, amber and gold patterns that painted the alcove in gentle light despite the sadness that seemed to permeate the entire garden. Dr. Torres, she said, there is something I need to tell you about sanguinari biology that may affect your perspective on our interactions. What is it? When we form emotional attachments, they create biochemical changes that are permanent. The connections we develop become part of our neural architecture, affecting our perceptions and responses for the remainder of our existence. I tried to process the implications of this information. You're saying that sanguinari emotional bonds are literally unbreakable. I am saying that the attachment I have developed to you will remain part of who I am regardless of whether we ever see each other again. The weight of this revelation settled over me like a physical presence. And you're telling me this because I want you to understand that if you were to make a similar commitment, it would have consequences that extend beyond normal human relationship parameters. What kind of consequences? Sanguinari biotechnology can extend human lifespan considerably. The changes involved would allow you to share something approaching our temporal perspective. I stared at her, trying to understand what she was suggesting. You're talking about changing my fundamental biology. I am talking about offering you choices that would not normally be available to your species. And what would those choices involve? She reached into her robes and withdrew a small crystalline device that pulsed with bioluminescent patterns similar to those displayed by the garden ferns. This contains biotechnological modifications that would allow your neural and cellular systems to interface with sanguinari enhancement protocols. Enhancement protocols. Extended lifespan, enhanced cognitive capacity, improved physical resilience, and the ability to form the kind of permanent emotional bonds that characterize sanguinari relationships. I looked at the device, understanding that it represented a choice that would change everything about my existence as a human being. And if I were to accept this, you would become something between human and sanguinari. You would retain your essential nature while gaining capabilities that would allow you to share a life measured in centuries rather than decades. With you. If that is what you choose. The implications crashed over me like cosmic waves, carrying possibilities that I'd never imagined and responsibilities that seemed almost too vast to comprehend. I would be choosing not just a relationship, but a fundamental transformation of my essential nature. I would be abandoning my human identity in favor of something unprecedented, a hybrid existence that would make me a bridge between species. Your Majesty, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, are you asking me what I think you're asking me? I am asking if you would be willing to accept modifications that would allow us to share existence on equal temporal terms. You're asking me to marry you. I am asking you to become something new with me. The ferns around us had shifted to brilliant golds and deep purples, their bioluminescent display creating patterns that seemed to celebrate the emotional resonances they were detecting. The entire garden felt alive with possibility, as if the alien plants understood the significance of the moment better than I did. I looked into Queen Lyraleth's eyes, seeing depths that held centuries of accumulated wisdom and loneliness, and realized that my answer would determine not just my own future but potentially the entire relationship between human and sanguinari civilizations. Will you marry me? I whispered, the words carrying implications that extended far beyond traditional human concepts of marriage. Her smile was radiant enough to power distant stars. Yes. The crystalline device in her hands pulsed brighter, responding to the emotional resonances of our shared commitment. Around us, the bioluminescent ferns erupted in displays of gold and silver light, their synchronized patterns creating a natural celebration that painted the entire garden in colors of joy and possibility. Dr. Torres, she said, rising from the bench with fluid grace, are you prepared to become something the universe has never seen before? I stood beside her, taking her hand and feeling the subtle energy field that surrounded her extending to encompass us both. I've been preparing for that my entire career without knowing it. Then let us begin the transformation that will unite two worlds. As we walked together toward whatever impossible future awaited us, I reflected on the strange path that had brought me to this moment. A week ago, I'd been a xenobiologist with theoretical knowledge and practical maintenance skills. Now I was about to become something unprecedented, a bridge between species, a symbol of possibility, and the husband of an immortal alien queen. It was, I decided, the kind of career advancement that definitely wasn't covered in any employee handbook. But sometimes the universe offered opportunities that transcended normal career planning, and sometimes the most important choice was the willingness to become something entirely new. I just hoped that Queen Lyraleth was right about humans having a talent for impossibility engineering, because we were about to attempt the most impossible project in the history of interspecies relations. But then again, I'd been fixing things that shouldn't work for my entire career. How different could cosmic marriage really be,